people who seem the calmest don't care less at all. They've simply stopped giving away control of their peace. And if you think that sounds like indifference, you've already fallen into the trap that keeps most people exhausted. Lao Tzu didn't teach withdrawal. He taught a specific kind of attention that looks like doing nothing and produces better results than forcing ever could. By the end of this video, you will have one practice you can use before your next difficult conversation: the great misunderstanding. The word detachment has been translated so badly over the last century that most viewers now think it means indifference, and that single misunderstanding has cost them more peace than they realize. It's expensive. They think it means not caring or suppressing what you feel or avoiding the problem until it somehow disappears on its own. Indifference isn't detachment, it's the decision to shut down, and suppression is even worse because it stores the emotion in a place where it gains interest over time. You're not becoming peaceful, you're building a pressure vessel that will crack at the worst possible moment. Avoidance looks smarter because it wears the costume of wisdom. You tell yourself you're rising above the situation when what you're actually doing is refusing to process it. The problem doesn't disappear, it waits for your guard to drop, and then it collects with interest. This is the abstract trap. You have tried the meditation apps, and you have heard the advice to just let it go, and you still wake up at 3 a.m. with the same anxiety running loops in your chest. The advice wasn't wrong. The translation failed. Here's what most people miss. The real trap isn't the emotion itself, but the hidden assumption that controlling a situation means controlling your emotional reaction to it. You think that if you can manage your anxiety, you have managed the meeting, but those are two different things, and only one of them is actually under your control. That pattern should sound familiar because you have read the books and you have done the breathing exercises, and the anxiety is still there because none of those tools addressed the root problem. You are trying to force your peace into a shape it refused to take, and that's the real exhaustion. This is why the modern self-help industry keeps selling you the same repackaged advice in brighter packaging. It's easier to sell a new app than to tell you that you have fundamentally misunderstood the original instruction and that you're practicing the exact opposite of what it asked. The instruction was never about caring less, and it wasn't about becoming cold. It was about stopping the forcing. Think about the last time someone told you to just let it go, and you realized they hadn't given you a method at all, only an excuse to stop paying attention to what was actually happening. That's not detachment, it's a form of abandonment you have mistaken for strength. You have seen this in your own life. You have seen the colleague who announces they're done caring and then becomes impossible to work with, and you have seen the partner who says they have let it go and then brings it up 3 months later at a dinner party. That isn't detachment. It's a lie you tell yourself while the debt compounds in the background. This is the cost of misunderstanding. You spend years building a wall between yourself and your own emotions, and then you wonder why you feel completely numb when good things finally happen to you. You have confused protection with peace, and they're not the same thing. So if detachment isn't indifference, suppression, or avoidance, the answer is older than the translation, and it has nothing to do with becoming cold. It has to do with understanding what you're attached to. That's where Lao Tzu comes in, not as a mystic on a mountain, but as a man who watched an empire rot from the inside and wrote a manual on what happens when you stop forcing reality to be something it's not. What Lao Tzu actually taught. The year is somewhere between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, and China is tearing itself apart. The Warring States period turned the continent into a chessboard where kingdoms rise and fall overnight, and the people living through it have the same stress response you feel right now. They're exhausted, forcing order onto chaos that refuses to be ordered. This is the world that produced the Tao Te Ching. It wasn't written by a man who retreated to a quiet monastery. Someone wrote it after watching power destroy everyone who clung to it, realizing that attachment to outcomes is the single greatest source of pain in a world you don't control. The text doesn't tell you to stop caring. It tells you to stop holding. Chapter 44 says it directly. Be content with what you have and rejoice in the way things are, because when you realize there's nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you. That's not a platitude, it's a strategic position. Here's what most people miss. The Tao isn't a god and it's not a feeling. It's the underlying pattern through which things actually move, closer to the grain of reality, and Chapter 5 makes this point with a precision that would make a physicist jealous. The chapter says the Tao doesn't take sides. It gives rise to both good and bad, and the sage is impartial in the same way heaven and earth are impartial, not because the sage is cold, but because the sage has no preference. The rain falls on the just and unjust, and it doesn't check your resume before it lands. You've probably noticed this pattern because you've spent more energy than you want to admit trying to change the weather in your own day. That's not virtue, that's attachment, wearing a responsible costume, and it exhausts you because you're trying to control the uncontrollable with preference. This is where Wu Wei enters, and here's what most people get wrong about it. Wu Wei isn't the absence of action, it's the absence of forcing, but the action is real. The movement is real, the work is real, and there's no longer a gap between the actor and the action. Zhuangzi gives us Cook Ding, a butcher who spent 19 years carving oxen without ever dulling his blade because he doesn't strike the bone. Cook Ding finds the spaces between the joints and lets the blade move through them with no resistance. He's not doing less, he's doing precisely. Think about your own work. The project that failed because you forced a timeline the team couldn't meet, and the conversation that soured because you pushed an opinion past its usefulness. You weren't lacking effort, you were striking bone, and the bone doesn't bend. There's a difference between surrender and resignation. Most viewers collapse the two into a single category that makes them afraid of both. Resignation is giving up. Surrender is the decision to stop fighting reality, to see where action is possible, because one is a prison, the other a door. Zhuangzi took this further in the butterfly dream. He dreamed he was a butterfly, and when he woke, he didn't know if he was Zhuangzhou, who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming it was the man. The point isn't poetic, it's practical. That's attachment. The butterfly doesn't cling to being a butterfly because it simply is, and that quality of being without defense is what Zhuangzi called ziran, which means naturalness and the absence of performance. But here's where the story gets stranger. The deepest tester of this principle wasn't a dream or a butcher's blade. It came down to love and grief, and the way Zhuangzi faced that grief is the clearest picture of what detachment looks like when it's not abstract. We will come back to that. Stay with me. The Warring States period lasted 250 years, and 250 years of war produced a manual on not forcing written by people left with no choice but to find a way to stay sane while everything around them burned. That's not mysticism, it's survival strategy. These weren't monks remote from pain. They were administrators, soldiers, cooks and parents who watched their kingdoms collapse and still functioned the next morning. The Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi were written for people exactly like you, people who can't retreat to a mountain and need something that works in a burning house. So if detachment isn't withdrawal, indifference, or the absence of action, then the question is what it looks like in the middle of your day. And the answer comes down to 4 specific practices. The first is the one most viewers skip because it seems too obvious. 4 ways to practice emotional detachment. The first practice is the most obvious and therefore the most ignored. Stop trying to control people. Controlling another person is like striking bone with a blade never meant to hit it. You dull and exhaust yourself, and you don't change them in any way that lasts. Think about the micromanager rewriting slides their team will ignore, the parent rewriting a child's homework, and the partner trying to fix someone who never asked. None are helping, all are forcing, and forcing always produces the opposite result. Modern psychology calls this the boundary between influence and control. Acceptance and commitment therapy maps directly onto the Taoist view of non-attachment. Not withdrawal, but moving your blade to the space where it can actually cut. You don't have to approve of what they do, but you must stop trying to change them by force, because forcing costs you more than disagreement ever could. Here's what most people miss. You don't need the other person to change for you to stop controlling them. You only need to see that your control isn't producing the outcome you want. The grain prices fall whether Emperor Wu watches or not. That summed up the lesson. But controlling people isn't the only way you leak power. There's a quieter trap hiding inside the stories you tell yourself about what other people think of you when you lie awake at night. It costs you more than almost anything else you do without knowing it. The second practice is this: stop taking everything personally. The silence in the meeting, the unanswered email, and the glance across the room aren't about you. Most of what other people do has nothing to do with you. It comes down to their exhaustion and their own attachment to things you have never seen. The Tao is impartial. It produces both good and bad, fair bosses and difficult ones, and it doesn't choose sides simply because your name is on the project. The rain falls on the just and unjust. It doesn't check your resume first. You have mistaken their pattern for your verdict. The unanswered email isn't a judgment, the silence isn't a punishment, and the driver who cut you off isn't conspiring against your day. They move through their own pattern, and your peace doesn't depend on making it about you. Acceptance and commitment. Therapy calls this cognitive diffusion. You learn to see your thoughts and external signals as passing events rather than commands you must obey. The more quickly you make that separation, the more energy you have for what faces you. And here's where the idea gets deeper. Even if you stop taking things personally and stop controlling the people around you, there's still one attachment that exhausts high achievers more than any other. It's the belief that your happiness depends on what happens next. The third practice is the hardest for the high achiever to hear. Stop making your happiness depend on outcomes, not because you have stopped wanting things, but because you have seen the outcome was never under your control. The promotion, the deal, and the text back are things you can influence, but can't guarantee. Chapter 44 already made this point. When you realize there's nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you. That's not gratitude journaling. It's the strategic position of someone who stopped betting peace on a future they can't control. Performance psychology confirms this. A 2021 study on Wu Wei in sport found athletes who focused on effortless action saw better outcomes, not because they were trying less, but because they were forcing less. Their attention was on the process, not the medal, and the process is the only thing you own. Remember the presentation you bombed, the project that collapsed, and the relationship that ended even though you did everything right. In each case, your happiness was mortgaged to an outcome. And when it failed, your peace went into foreclosure because you bet everything on dice you didn't control. That's not bad luck, it's a bad strategy, and it's correctable. The ACT framework calls this values-based action. You act from what matters to you, not from what result you demand from the universe. When you stop mortgaging your peace to the outcome, your performance improves because your attention is no longer split between the task and the terror. But the hardest one to accept is this. It makes the other three possible, and it sounds like giving up while being the most difficult form of strength you will ever develop. The fourth practice is love without possession. Not because love is weak, but because love that tries to own its object isn't love at all. The Taoist tradition says the clearest illustration of the real thing. It's fear wearing a better costume. Zhuangzi's wife died. His friend Hui Shi found him singing and beating on a pot. Hui Shi told him he'd acted with disrespect. Zhuangzi replied that at first he had grieved deeply, but then he remembered his wife existed before she had a body or spirit, and now she had returned to the great source. He saw the cycle and accepted it. He didn't skip or suppress the grief. He felt it completely and then let it move through him like water through a channel, because that's what grief wants to do if you don't build a dam. The grief was real, the clinging was optional, and he chose not to cling. This is what the river metaphor means. The river doesn't cling to every leaf that passes. It doesn't try to hold or shape the leaf or demand that it stay, because it allows the leaf to pass and remains a river. That's not coldness, that's capacity. Modern psychology calls this healthy detachment. It's the boundary that keeps love from becoming surveillance, the difference between checking on someone and checking their location, and the complete reverse of indifference, because it requires you to be fully present while releasing the need to control what you can't keep. You don't lose the person by letting them be what they are. You lose them by trying to make them into something they're not, and then you resent them for the performance they can't sustain. The river stays where it is. The river never needed the leaf. What changes? This is the payoff, and it arrives faster than you think. Within days, you become calmer because your peace is no longer collateral damage of someone else's behavior. Your mood is no longer for sale, and the people who used to push your buttons find the button has been moved. The same shift makes you harder to manipulate. When your reaction isn't for sale, the lever disappears. The colleague who baited you last week has nothing to push against, and the family member who wrecked your holiday finds the wound has healed into a callus, not because you forgave them, but because you stopped giving them access. Presence is the next thing that returns. The energy you spent on outcomes you don't control is now available for the conversation in front of you. The email can wait, and the anxiety about tomorrow has lost its real estate in your mind. The person across from you gets the version of you that's actually listening. Resilience follows from the same mechanism. Setbacks become information instead of identity, and a failed project is data, not a verdict on your value. A rejected proposal is a no, not a prophecy, and you recover faster because you stopped making every outcome into a referendum on who you are. And the last change is the one you will feel first. You become more authentic. You stop performing competence and start operating from actual capacity. The mask you built to survive starts to dissolve, not because you have become vulnerable, but because you stopped needing the approval of people you don't respect. The mechanism is simple. You stop bleeding energy into things you don't control, so you have more energy for the things you do. It's not a feeling, it's a budget. The people who ignore this don't become more powerful. They become Emperor Wu, convinced that grain prices only fall because he keeps watching. The difference between who you are now and who you could be by next week isn't a personality transplant. It's a single decision to stop treating your peace as a variable that depends on other people's behavior. Your peace isn't a bonus that arrives when the world cooperates. It's your baseline. You have been giving it away for free. Here's where this lands for you. The practice isn't complicated. It's simply the absence of forcing applied to one situation at a time, and the situation you pick first will tell you where your attachment is costing you the most. That's your entry point, and it's closer than you think. Your homework. Pick one situation where you're forcing an outcome and practice the absence of forcing for 24 hours. Don't push or pull. Let the situation be and watch your energy. Most people won't do this. Be different. Try it for one day. Then drop a comment telling me where you're forcing something the situation isn't asking for. The Tao teaches that open hands can receive what closed fists never will, And the more tightly we cling, the more life slips through our fingers, because peace begins when we stop trying to hold what was never ours to control. Where are you forcing something right now? And subscribe. We go this deep every week.